welcome again to our looking at this weekend's scripture readings, which on this fourth Sunday or weekend of Easter, the first reading is from the book of the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 4, verses 8 through 12. The second reading is from the letter of John, chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. And the gospel, we return now to the gospel tradition of John. I mentioned that John is used quite regularly during the Easter season and will be the primary gospel now right until Pentecost Sunday. So this week we're looking at chapter 10 of John's gospel, particularly at verses 11 through 18. I'd like to begin by taking a little bit of time to look at the first reading, the Acts of the Apostles. Now, as we've mentioned, and it is the fundamental first reading throughout the Easter season, but it doesn't follow things sequentially. It tends to jump around, kind of giving us little snippets of a rather long book. There's some 28 chapters in Acts. So the reason for choosing some of these is interesting. This week we come to chapter 4, which is preceded now, what precedes this in the story of Acts. Remember that the book of Acts tells the story of the development of the Christian experience in the early years from the viewpoint of this particular writer. Luke Acts is the only work that we have that tells the story of the development of the Christian experience from the viewpoint of this particular author. So he tells the story of the development. Now, if one had a map, would notice that it begins in Israel or in Palestine and then moves north, crosses into Antioch, which is in modern-day Syria, and then moves across westward across what was known as Asia Minor, today Turkey, and tells the story of the spread of the gospel, particularly from the viewpoints of Peter and Paul. But today, we're still in the city of Jerusalem. I may have mentioned this. The opening 8 chapters of the book of Acts describe what happens in the city of Jerusalem. So it is there that this gospel writer sees the formation of the Christian communities. Basically, it's going to be made up of members who accept Jesus, but the background of those who accept Jesus is varietous. Some are those fellow Hebrews. Remember that by and large, these are Hebrews, members of the Jewish community who embrace the message of Jesus. Some of them are those who have retained the understanding of Israel's way through the language of Hebrew and the customs of the Hebrew experience. Other Jews have also, and there's a great variety of Jewish thinking and acting in the first century world, have embraced what is known as Hellenism. They are what we would call Hellenic Jews. They do not see, therefore the language they would, for example, use would be Greek, and they do not see all of the customs that were part of the empire at the time. Keep in mind that the Roman world had adopted and adapted many of the Greek customs and practices, even the language. So we're not opposed to that, saw that there was some benefit to that, but that would cause a controversy within Judaism itself. Now, the reading this time pictures Peter and John giving a talk. Why? Because earlier on, and this is where one needs to put things a little bit into context, earlier on in chapter 3, Peter and John had been pictured going up to the temple in the afternoon around 3 o'clock to pray in the temple. So they were keeping the tradition both of centering life in the temple, in the center of Jerusalem. And on the way, they are met by a beggar who has his cup out or whatever he had out, looking for a handout. And Peter says to the beggar, "Gold and silver I have not, but what I do have, in the name of Jesus of Nazareth I say, arise and walk." And the man had not only got up, but jumped up and jumped around. And of course, everyone who was in the temple area or those watching what was happening would have noticed this event. So it's a story of a healing or a cure that takes place by Peter and John. And now the word reaches the authorities, again, who are the leaders in Jerusalem. Now, we've mentioned this before. The two names that appear quite regularly in the gospel tradition are two sects within Judaism, namely the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But the group that was particularly in charge, you remember, of what went on in the temple area were the Sadducees. Now, what is pictured as the leadership in Jerusalem, when it hears that people are beginning to kind of embrace whatever this message is that Peter and John are proclaiming, having, they got the attention now of many by the action of the cure, are now talking about the fact that the power that they have received to do this healing comes because of the risen Jesus. And there are a number who listen, who are favorably accepting this message, and that seems to disturb certain of the leaders. So much so that they arrest James and John and Peter, tell them, please, I don't maybe use the word please, but more strongly, stop doing this. It's wrong. They don't, okay, and they listen and go out and continue to do it. So this really aggravates the leadership, and they call now what is called the Sanhedrin, or the Great Council. Now, we're not exactly sure what the membership of this Great Council was. Certainly the phrase Sanhedrin is important in Jewish life, but the way in which it is presented in the Acts was not perhaps the way in which it actually existed in the time that the story in Acts is narrated. The Sanhedrin became much more powerful and more identifiable when, after the fall of the city of Jerusalem in the year 70, leadership of Israel moved to the north, up to the Galilee, and there seems to have been where the Sanhedrin was more operative. But Luke, in telling the story now, puts everything back in Jerusalem and mentions this great council, which would have been made up of members of the Sadducee group, perhaps some scribes and Pharisees. He names, and what we find is a carryover from the gospel when Jesus is arrested into now this particular setting. He names some of the persons who are involved. Annas, he names, who was the high priest in Judaism between the year 6 and 15. He was succeeded to that position by his son-in-law, Joseph, or Joseph Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the name by which he is more regularly known, who exercised this role for a number of years as chief high priest from the year 17 to the year 36. So you will remember that when Jesus is brought in, he is brought before Annas, who kind of questions him. This again is according to Luke, who is also the author of Acts. So see how this all works. And then sends Jesus over to Caiaphas. Now, what Caiaphas does, we really don't know. It was Annas who had said, it's necessary for one person to die for the sake of the community. Interesting thought. And of course, Luke will pick up on that the death of Jesus has, and as well as the resurrection, effect for everyone. One man's activity has brought redemption and help to everyone. So exactly, my point is, who makes up this great council would be those members. Acts also lists a man named John and Alexander, who we believe belong to the chief priest family. So when you talk about this as a great council, is this a particular family that is disturbed with what Peter and John are doing? So they are told, stop doing this, stop teaching. In fact, have them arrested. Well, that doesn't work because somehow in the middle of the night, an angel comes, opens up the prison, and releases Peter and John. The next day, when the council goes to see where are they, find that the jail is empty, and someone says, oh, they're back out in the middle teaching again. They haven't really run away. So that disturbs, as you can guess, the leadership. Now, I think it might be important to point out it's only the leadership that seems to be really disturbed with what Peter and John are teaching and doing. And as Luke presents it, he presents these two men as both philosophers and prophets. Now, the idea of a philosopher would have been very appealing to those of the Hellenic or Greek background, as I mentioned. The prophet would have been more something that those of the Hebraic or Old Testament tradition would have been familiar with. To join these two shows what Luke is attempting to do. He's hoping to bring together different segments of Judaism in accepting Jesus to arrive at a unity of spirit and a unity of action. Now, it also says that as this event is being narrated, that Jesus is the stone that has been rejected by the builders. Now, that, of course, is an interesting phrase, because it then goes on to say that that rejected stone, which happens to be, in this case, using a little bit of metaphor, happens to be Jesus, is the cornerstone, or better translated, the head of the corner. Now, and we might know this as a capstone. In other words, there was a particular stone, you see this in some buildings, particularly with arches, that as the arches come up, in the very middle is a stone that kind of serves as the bridge between the two, and therefore holds the arch together. That's the image now that is being presented here, that Jesus is that, the cornerstone, the stone that had been rejected. Who rejects it? Some of the leaders, okay? Now has become that which joins together, which creates a certain sense of unity. So when you look at a building and you kind of see, sometimes buildings even today have a stone in the middle, which would, the irony is, when we use the word cornerstone, we tend to think of buildings that have outside, if you notice, at the corner of the building is the cornerstone. That's not what is meant here. That's why the term capstone is perhaps a better word. So anyway, the two disciples are forbidden to give the message, but they don't listen. They continue to do that. So, and they kind of say to the leaders, you know, you should be paying attention to this. Now, as they are doing this, it's interesting that throughout the Acts, on certain occasions, those who are teaching and those who are present receive the gift of the Spirit. So we mentioned this gospel and the Acts, which is related to the gospel, uses frequently the idea of the Holy Spirit. Going all the way back in the gospel, we remember that it is the Spirit who comes on Mary and is responsible for the conception of Jesus, and a number of other cases. So here, they are filled with the Spirit, and they continue the teaching. What is next presented, and it's important to see this, it occurs twice in the Acts, one in chapter 2 and now in chapter 4. Listen to it carefully because I think it has some interesting aspects. Here's what it says, that they were all of one heart and soul, nor did any one of them having something call it their own. They had everything in common. So interestingly, that a kind of communalism we would call, because we wouldn't want to use the word communism, but sharing communally everything. He continues to say in this section of Acts, neither was anyone among them needy, for whoever owned fields or possessed homes sold them, and carrying the proceeds from them, from those sold, laid them at the feet of the apostles. Can you imagine doing that? Selling your house and leaving it at, well, the feet of your local pastor. Would not be something we would think to do, but it's a very interesting little section of Acts where he distributes and continues that, just to finish it up, that the distribution was made, so as the text, to each one according to anyone's need. So what a perfect and wonderful community, sharing, listening, helping, supporting one another. As wonderful as that might be, we do think that perhaps Luke is imagining what the perfect Christian community would be. I suspect that never really happened. Now, if you read on, and this is not something you'll hear this weekend, but if one reads on in chapter 5, which immediately obviously comes after chapter 4, there's the story of a man named Joseph, Barnabas, who has a piece of property, and he sells that property and does exactly what the wording just said, places it at the feet of the apostles. So this is establishing a certain priority to the apostles in terms of leadership, but also in making things done. There is one further little section, if you read on in chapter 5, that there is a husband and wife who also, perhaps inspired by Barnabas, do the same thing. They sell some property, but he comes, that is the husband, comes to Peter and says, here, I give you what I have sold. But in fact, he has kept half of it to himself and only given the part of it to Peter, making the claim that he's doing the whole thing. In response to that, Peter looks at him and says, you're not telling the truth, and the guy is struck dead immediately. Now, a little while later, his wife comes. She kind of says the same thing. She says that it's the whole thing they're given. And she, of course, knows, and she, with her husband, has kept half of it. She does not know her husband is dead. And immediately after she does this, she is finished off. Now, Luke would make the point with these stories, be careful what you say. If you are going to do something, tell the truth, but do not lie to the disciples. Well, all of that's a little bit further than the little section that we hear this week, but I mention this because we're going to get snippets of Acts, and this part will not be part of the Sunday presentation. So if you have some goods, you're invited to give it, but be sure that you're truthful in exactly how much you are giving. All right, so that's the section from Acts. Now, to John's Gospel, the 10th chapter is, and I pause here because those of you who remembered last year when we looked at the fourth Sunday of Easter, chapter 10 offered us verses 1 through 10. This week, or this year, chapter 10 offers us the next verses, 11 through 18. And then next year, we get chapter 10, verses 22 through 30. So in a certain way, it's broken up. Now, what is this? Is the chapter, and this weekend, perhaps the centering story is that of the Good Shepherd. Now, what we hear in the section that we hear this time, and just to refresh a little bit, last year that section had begun by shepherding, you remember, of course, would have been very appealing to the Hebrew community. Much of their life had been nomadic, and even in Jesus' time, there were shepherding, or sheep were an important commodity for agriculture and for living. In fact, you remember on the occasion of Jesus' birth, the shepherds were out in the field and the angel announced them. So sheep, of course, would have been something that most people in first century world were familiar with, except if you were a genuine urban liver. You probably then did not see too many sheep, except that when it came time to offer sacrifice up in the temple area, they were sheep that were offered. So there is a rich connection in the tradition of Israel with regard to sheep. Now, this section does picture Jesus, the phrase that we are more and more familiar with, as the Good Shepherd, as opposed to, well, if you are a good shepherd, what are you opposed to? You're opposed to a bad shepherd, okay? I suppose you could be nice and say a not so good shepherd. In the course, and I just want to highlight what is an important part of this little section that we're listening to is the idea that Jesus says that the Good Shepherd is prepared to lay down his life for his sheep. Now, this is something unique to the Johannine tradition. Certainly, shepherding was part of the great ones of the past. Moses had been a shepherd. David had been a shepherd. Many of the other important leaders in Israel's history had been shepherds. So the idea of a shepherd leader was certainly part of the tradition. And the model seems to have been Davidic shepherding. So David, of course, always pictured as the greatest in this regard, would be considered the model. But in no place in looking at the Davidic shepherd is the idea of the shepherd dying for the sake of the community. So this is a unique aspect that is now brought into the message by the gospel writer John. In other words, we find no parallel to this in the Old Testament. To lay down one's life for one's brethren, or it could be translated to risk one's life, although certainly as John sees it, it is more than a risk. It was a reality that occurred and happened to Jesus. Now the story is told, and this is where again one needs to see the larger picture of John's gospel, goes all the way back to chapter 7, where Jesus had been in the temple area and he had caused a man to see, a blind man to see. Now you can go read this and see, you have this imagery of seeing. Now keep in mind that in John's gospel, seeing equals knowledge. Knowledge is seeing. So, oh, I got that idea, now I see it. That kind of thing. It isn't necessarily physical sight, but I suppose we might say it's insight. That is what's important here. Now also, as we're listening to this little section, Jesus is saying, pictured as saying, I have other sheep who are not part of the fold. Now this leads to the question, who are these other sheep? Some would say, well, perhaps they're the Gentiles that would open the door from Judaism to the others. Some think that it could be, as I mentioned earlier today, the Greek-speaking Jews. Perhaps these were the others that the gospel community hopes to embrace. Or it could be proselytes, those who are studying to become Christian. And this might have already been happening at the time that the Gospel of John was written, who had come down from Galilee in search for the light, the truth, that they might see. So there's a great deal of playing with imagery, you remember, in the Johannine Gospel. Light, seeing, etc., dark, the opposite, and all of that. Now here's where there's a little caution, and I remind you that we're looking at the gospel tradition, not what you may hear from the pulpit preached on Sunday, because there we follow a certain tradition. But when one reads the Gospel of John carefully, one notices that those who do not agree with the Jesus of this gospel are the ones who are in trouble. So who are the hirelings? Well, they could simply be, from John's point of view, Jews who have accepted Jesus, but not on John's terms. John's terms are what are important. Now, he calls those bad shepherds the hirelings, okay? Thieves, robbers, because a hireling obviously means you get paid for your job. So that's why you're a shepherd. And you love the sheep only to the degree that they're helping you make money. And if the wolves come and start to attack the sheep, do you fight them off? No, you're getting paid to watch them, you take off. And that's what, of course, the imagery here is, that the hirelings, literally, when you think of it, the word hire, is that they're in it for pay. They're not because they love the sheep. Unlike the good shepherd, who loves the sheep, and in that sense is even willing to lay down his life for the sheep. And therein, of course, is the kind of drift of this little section, 11 through 18 of chapter 10. The event here probably happens in the temple during the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, Tabernacles was one of the three major Jewish feasts, usually observed in the fall of the year. And as I say, it had been the time when in the temple Jesus had cured the blind man and had asked the question, and here, of course, is what continually appears again and again in John's Gospel, asked the question, who is Jesus? Who exactly is he? And you remember that the point of the Gospel writer John is that Jesus is the Son of God, that there is an intimate, close relationship between Jesus and the Father. And so much so that one might talk of that relationship as son to father. So as we put all of this together, and there are little bits and pieces here of this chapter, and we will have opportunity to look at some of this material again. But once again, the powerful images of John's Gospel come to the fore. At the time of the curing of the blind man, Jesus, as you remember in the Tabernacle Feast, it's a time of water. They used what they call living water. Jesus is called the living water. Jesus is the light of the world to be able to see. And of course, Jesus is the Son, the sent one. And in fact, after all of this happens, Jesus leaves the temple because there are some, that leadership bit, perhaps connecting it a little bit to what we spoke of earlier as taking place in the Acts, were out to silence Jesus. I think in the beginning they weren't out to kill him, but they did not want him to be speaking like this because it was contrary to their beliefs and to their traditions. Well, as we come together this week, once again, we observe that Jesus is the living water to anyone who thirsts, that Jesus truly is the light of the world, and that Jesus is the good shepherd who gathers into one fold all the sheep, those that are already belonging and those who the author and Jesus' hopes will belong. Thank you for being with us, and have a wonderful day.